welcome to the deep dive. We are incredibly thrilled to have you with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. And, before we really get into the weeds of our analysis today, please just take a quick second right now to like and subscribe to the show.
Yeah, it really helps us out and ensures you never miss out on these discussions.
Exactly, because today we are looking at something that is, it's genuinely ultra long, it's highly incisive, and it's just completely fascinating.
It really is. We're reviewing a brand new ebook today.
Right. It's titled Grievance to Power: How Resentment Shakes History by Conrad Riker. And honestly, I just have to start by talking about the cover art of this book.
Oh yeah, the cover it's striking.
It is impossible to ignore. Like, it immediately grabs you by the collar.
Yeah, you see it and you can't look away.
Exactly. It's this incredibly vivid, brightly colored, almost hyper-realistic image of a screaming and crying woman.
Right.
You can actually see the tears streaming down her face, and her expression is, it's completely contorted in just absolute fury and anguish.
It's very intense.
It is, and it perfectly, just viscerally captures the central theme of the text we're going to unpack today.
It's the visual embodiment of pure grievance.
That's exactly it. And to get the full experience of what we are talking about today, you absolutely must check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy this ebook for yourself.
Yes, definitely.
And make sure you go follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Yeah, you're going to want to follow his stuff. But going back to that cover image, it really is a profound choice.
Yeah.
It's unsettling, but intentionally so. I think it perfectly sets the stage for a very intense structural analysis.
For sure.
Because our mission today is to unpack Riker's comprehensive framework. We're going to examine how he builds the case that the core biological emotion of resentment has been historically weaponized to capture modern institutions. And, how that capture it actually affects everyday life.
Exactly. And if you've been paying attention to the shifting dynamics in modern masculinity...
Which a lot of our listeners do.
Right. Or if you've ever felt like traditional male roles are just constantly under a microscope these days, this deep dive is designed specifically for you.
Absolutely.
We really want to acknowledge you, our listener, specifically today. This analysis is uniquely tailored for those of you who operate in the men's rights advocacy space and the red-pilled manosphere.
It is meticulously designed for you guys.
Yeah, to help you understand the historical architecture behind these societal shifts. We're looking really closely at how our traditional structures functioned before they were, as the author argues, fundamentally altered by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
That is the absolute core of Riker's thesis.
Yeah.
And we are going to explore every single corner of it today.
We are. But before we really dive headfirst into the text, we have a crucial disclaimer to make.
Right, just to set the ground rules for how we're approaching this material.
Yes, this is absolutely vital. Because the source material dives deeply into highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
Yeah, it touches on both left-wing and right-wing ideologies. So we, as your hosts, will never take any sides.
Never. We are entirely neutral here.
Our job today isn't to endorse these viewpoints or to tell you what to think. We are impartially reporting on the contents of the ebook to just convey the original ideas and arguments presented by Conrad Riker.
Exactly. We are simply acting as your analytical guides.
Right. We just want to help you understand the fascinating architecture of this text. Lay out the blueprint of his arguments and let you decide for yourself what to make of it.
That's the goal.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What really caught me off guard initially is that Riker doesn't start his book with modern politics.
No, he doesn't.
Or even the culture wars. He goes way back. He starts with biology. Why start there?
Well, because he needs to establish a foundational premise. He argues that we fundamentally misunderstand what resentment actually is.
Oh, so?
We tend to think of it as a fleeting, petty emotion. Like the irritation you feel when someone cuts you off in traffic.
Right, or takes credit for your idea at work.
Exactly. But according to the framework in the book, resentment is a deeply ingrained evolutionary survival mechanism.
A survival mechanism?
Yeah, it is hardwired into the neurological systems of human beings. And the broader animal kingdom, too. It's not a character flaw.
It's a biological imperative.
Exactly.
So he's essentially saying it's a built-in alarm system. What is the alarm responding to?
It's a byproduct of our fundamental need to secure resources, mates, and territory.
Okay.
In the wild, when resources are scarce and your neighbor has more than you, feeling a sense of injustice or resentment isn't just a passing mood.
It's doing something physical.
Right. It is a physiological signal. It triggers adrenaline, cortisol, and a heightened state of awareness.
Wow.
It tells the organism to fight, to compete, to disrupt the hierarchy, to ensure its own genetic survival.
I get the abstract idea of that, but he uses some really brutal analogies from the animal kingdom to prove this point. He talks about lions, right?
He does, and it's a very stark example. He looks at male lions taking over a pride.
Okay.
When a new male defeats the old alpha and takes control, one of his first acts is often to kill the cubs of his rival.
Which is just, it's awful to think about.
It is, but Riker argues that this isn't just mindless violence. It is resentment in its rawest, most functional form.
Because it serves a purpose.
Exactly. It is brutal, primal, and necessary for the new lion's genetic survival. It ensures the lionesses go into heat and carry his offspring instead of the rivals.
Right. And he also points to wolf packs, doesn't he?
Yeah, the dynamic with wolves is fascinating. In a wolf pack, there is a strict hierarchy.
Right. Alphas and betas.
The author notes that lower-ranking wolves frequently show measurable signs of physiological stress.
Like actual chemical changes.
Yes, higher cortisol levels, and behavioral resentment toward the alpha wolf.
How does that look in practice?
They will test boundaries, challenge the alpha for food, and basically just wait for a moment of weakness. The resentment is the fuel that keeps the hierarchy dynamic.
It ensures that only the strongest actually lead the pack. The chimpanzee case study he included really stood out to me as well, because he describes how chimps have these incredibly complex, almost political social structures.
Yes. Chimps are our closest living relatives, so their behavior is highly relevant to his thesis.
Right.
The book describes experiments and observations where a lower-ranking chimp is purposefully passed over for food or denied access to mates, while a higher-ranking chimp is rewarded.
And what happens?
The neglected chimp exhibits visible, measurable signs of stress, agitation, and aggression. Riker says this isn't just random animal noise.
It is resentment in action.
Yes, the chimp feels cheated. It recognizes a violation of fairness within its social order, and that feeling drives it to form coalitions, scheme, and compete much harder the next time.
Okay, so I understand the biology of a lion or a chimp, but how does the book bridge the gap from a jungle animal to complex human societies?
It scales up.
Right, but does he give a historical example of this primal resentment operating on a human scale?
He does. He argues that human societies operate on these exact same primal hardware systems, just on a mass scale.
Okay.
When there is systemic unfairness, or when resources are threatened by an outside group, that biological resentment is triggered en masse.
What's the historical example he uses?
He uses the Irish potato famine in the 1840s as a prime example.
Right, because the famine wasn't just a tragedy of a crop failure. I remember reading in the text that it was a massive breeding ground for a very specific type of grievance.
Exactly. The potato blight was a natural disaster, yes. But the author points out that while millions of Irish people were starving to death or being forced to emigrate,
The British landlords were doing what?
they were actively exporting massive quantities of other foods, grain, livestock, shipping it all out of Ireland for profit.
Wow.
So the resource scarcity triggered a deep primal resentment because the Irish population recognized the profound unfairness of the situation.
It wasn't just that they were hungry.
No, it was that they were being actively deprived by a ruling class.
And he brings that exact same psychological mechanism right up to the modern era, comparing it to the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah, the parallel he draws there is fascinating. In 2008, millions of everyday people lost their homes. They lost their life savings, their livelihoods.
It was devastating.
And simultaneously, they watched on television as the financial elites who had engineered the crisis through reckless speculation,
They were bailed out.
bailed out by the government with taxpayer money.
Yeah.
Very few went to jail.
And many kept their bonuses.
Exactly. So Riker argues that the immense anger directed at those bailed out elites, whether it manifested as the Tea Party movement on the right or Occupy Wall Street on the left.
It was exactly the same primal resentment.
Yes. It is the biological response to a violation of fairness and reciprocity within the human tribe.
So if this biological response is always simmering beneath the surface when there is inequality, what does this actually mean for politics? Because Riker argues that political leaders don't just observe this biological response, right?
No, they actively harness it. This is really the pivot point in his historical framework. Riker asserts that resentment is the literal fuel that ignites revolutions, topples empires, and reshapes societies.
So a skilled leader doesn't try to soothe the resentment.
No, they weaponize it. They point that biological anger at a specific target. And he provides a wide array of historical examples to demonstrate how leaders from completely different ends of the political spectrum have tapped into this.
He spends a good amount of time analyzing the 2016 U.S. presidential election through this lens, right?
He does. He argues that Donald Trump didn't just run a traditional policy-focused political campaign.
What did he do differently?
He successfully weaponized a massive reservoir of resentment.
Interesting.
The book claims Trump tapped into the simmering anger of millions of working-class Americans who felt entirely left behind by globalization.
People who felt ignored by the coastal political elite.
Yes, and betrayed by what they perceived as a completely rigged economic system.
There's that famous quote the book mentions where Trump said, "I love the poorly educated." And the mainstream media play that as a massive gaffe or an insult to his own base. But how does Riker interpret that moment?
Well, according to the text, it was the exact opposite of an insult. Riker argues it was a masterful validation of their resentment.
By saying he loves the poorly educated.
Yeah, because by saying that, he was telling a massive demographic of people who felt looked down upon by academia and the media, I see you, I value you, and your anger at the system is justified.
He turned their biological feeling of being deprived of status into actionable political power.
Precisely.
But the author is very clear that this isn't just a tactic used by the right wing. He actually takes us across the globe to the Cultural Revolution in China to show how it works on the radical left.
Yes, and this is where the historical examples get incredibly dark. He explains how Mao Zedong recognized the incredible explosive power of collective anger.
So this was in the 1960s.
Right. In the 1960s, Mao felt his grip on power slipping, so he mobilized the youth of China, the Red Guards.
And he gave them a target.
Gave him a target.
Yeah.
The four olds.
What were the four olds, exactly?
Old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas.
So basically anything traditional.
Everything traditional. Mao fueled the youth's resentment against anyone who held traditional authority. Teachers, intellectuals, the educated elite, the bourgeoisie, even their own parents.
Wow.
He essentially told a generation of young people that the reason they didn't have power or a perfect utopian society was because of these traditional figures.
And the result of that?
As Riker details, it was a massive wave of violence, public humiliation, and the destruction of historical artifacts. It left millions dead or internally exiled.
That is terrifying.
Mao's genius, according to this framework, was channeling that mass, primal resentment into a weapon to just eliminate his political rivals and solidify his absolute control.
And then the book examines the rise of fascism in Germany, showing how the exact same psychological tool was used to build the Third Reich.
Yeah, the conditions in Germany after World War I were a perfect breeding ground for this. The nation was economically crippled by hyperinflation.
And deeply humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles.
Exactly. Riker writes that the German people felt profoundly betrayed by their own leaders and maliciously exploited by the victorious Allies. They were starved of resources and national pride.
So Hitler steps into this vacuum. How does he utilize the resentment?
Well, Hitler didn't just exploit the resentment, he curated it. He gave the German people specific scapegoats to blame for all their suffering.
Pointing the finger.
Pointing the finger at Jews, communists, and the Allied powers.
Right.
By focusing all that diffuse biological anger onto specific groups, he promised to restore the nation's pride and resources. It's the ultimate, most horrific example in the book of how weaponized grievance can mobilize a society toward absolute catastrophe.
It's really terrifying to think of it as a mechanical process. But this raises an important question that the book addresses. Does resentment only build regimes, or does it tear them down?
Oh, it absolutely tears them down. The author points to the collapse of the Soviet Union to illustrate this.
How so?
For decades, the Soviet people endured extreme shortages of basic goods, intense censorship, and brutal political repression.
Yeah, they were constantly told they lived in a worker's paradise, but their daily reality was one of standing in line for bread.
Exactly.
So what was the breaking point? I mean, why didn't they revolt earlier?
Because the state had a total monopoly on violence and information. But in the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms.
Glasnost and perestroika.
Right. Glasnost meant openness and perestroika meant restructuring.
Okay.
Riker argues that by allowing just a little bit of free speech, Gorbachev unwittingly uncorked decades of pent-up, boiling resentment.
The pressure valve was open.
Exactly. The people were suddenly allowed to express their anger at the lies, the corruption, and the sheer inefficiencies of the Soviet system.
And once that was unleashed,
It rapidly dismantled one of the world's two superpowers from the inside out.
He also mentions the Arab Spring as a more recent example of this sudden uncorking of anger.
Yes, he details the story of Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor.
Right, I remember this part.
Bouazizi was constantly harassed by corrupt local officials who confiscated his goods. In late 2010, pushed to the absolute brink of despair and humiliation, he set himself on fire in public protest.
A single desperate act.
And that single act sparked a region-wide uprising across the entire Middle East.
Wow.
Riker emphasizes that their resentment wasn't just about political ideology, it was fundamentally about dignity. They were tired of being treated as second-class citizens by corrupt, authoritarian regimes.
And he even brings this framework to the civil rights movement in the United States, which is interesting because we usually view that through a purely moral lens, not a biological one.
Right, it's a different angle. Riker argues that leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, despite their different methods, both successfully channeled a deeply justified multi-generational resentment.
Because African Americans had endured centuries of slavery, systemic violence, and segregation.
Yes. The leaders of the civil rights movement took that profound biological sense of injustice and forged it into a disciplined, organized movement that fundamentally changed the legal and social history of the United States.
Which seems to be a really crucial caveat in Riker's framework. He isn't saying that feeling aggrieved or resentful is inherently evil, right?
Not at all. He acknowledges that resentment is a neutral tool. It's a hammer.
You can build a house or smash a window.
Exactly. It can be a powerful catalyst for positive, necessary change when it is channeled effectively toward genuine justice and human dignity.
Okay,
But the core thesis of the book, the central argument he builds everything else upon, is that in the modern era, this evolutionary tool has been hijacked.
hijacked by whom?
Hijacked by specific modern ideological movements. He argues these movements use the language of grievance to capture modern institutions, rewrite cultural norms, and reshape society in ways that are highly detrimental to traditional structures.
And specifically detrimental to men. Okay, so that perfectly bridges us into the next major section of his analysis. We established the broad historical weaponization of grievance. Now we are shifting to how the author applies this specifically to gender dynamics.
This is where it gets very direct.
Yeah, this is where the book makes some of its most controversial, hard-hitting claims. Riker challenges what he calls the myth of gender equality.
Yes. He posits that the modern concept of gender equality, meaning absolute sameness in outcome and behavior, is fundamentally a biological myth.
A biological myth.
Yes. He argues that men and women are biologically, neurologically, and hormonally distinct, and therefore they are naturally suited for different societal roles.
Let's really drill down into the specific biological claims he makes here, because he relies heavily on endocrinology to make his case.
He focuses primarily on hormones. The text states that men are biologically driven by testosterone.
Right.
According to Riker, this hormonal reality makes men naturally competitive, more aggressive, risk-tolerant, and better suited for physically demanding tasks.
Or high-stakes leadership roles where decisive action is required.
Exactly. Conversely, he claims women are biologically predisposed to caregiving, empathy, and social cohesion.
And that's driven by different hormones.
Yes, driven in large part by higher levels of oxytocin, which is often called the bonding or love hormone.
So his argument is that our traditional societal structures, with men as providers and protectors and women as caregivers, weren't arbitrary social constructs.
No, not at all.
They're reflections of this underlying biology.
Exactly. He argues that traditional gender roles were an organic, evolutionary compromise designed to maximize the survival and flourishing of the human species.
Makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint.
And his central warning is that when a society actively rejects these natural biological roles in pursuit of absolute mandated equality,
What happened?
that society starts to fundamentally break down.
And this is really the launch pad for his massive critique of feminism. But what I found really interesting is that he doesn't dismiss the entire history of feminism right out of the gate.
No, he doesn't.
He actually tracks the evolution of the movement quite meticulously.
He does. He separates the movement into distinct waves to show exactly where he believes it went off the rails.
Right.
He actually looks favorably at first wave feminism, which took place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
So he points to the famous 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York.
Yes, led by figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony,
Why does he give them a pass?
because he calls their demands reasonable and objectively fair. They were fighting for basic legal parity.
Like the right to vote.
the right to vote, the right to own property independently of a husband, and the right to access higher education.
Okay.
Riker writes that most rational men eventually supported these goals because it was about basic fairness and legal equality. It was not, in his view, a movement aimed at dismantling the family unit.
Or demonizing men as a class.
Exactly.
But then, according to the timeline in the text, there is a massive tectonic shift in the 1960s. The tone and the goals of the movement completely change.
Yes, and he specifically names the architects of this shift into second-wave feminism. He points heavily at Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem.
So, what did they do?
Well, he cites Friedan's seminal 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique. Riker argues that this book famously, and in his view destructively, labeled the traditional suburban housewife as a prisoner of domesticity.
So she reframed the home entirely.
Yes, it framed the home not as a sanctuary, but as a comfortable concentration camp, to use a phrase often associated with that era's critique.
And what about Gloria Steinem's role?
He points to Steinem's creation of Mrs. Magazine. He argues that under her influence, the publication became the megaphone for a movement that increasingly viewed men not as partners, but as the enemy.
The patriarchy.
The patriarchy. The book claims that under the guidance of these figures, feminism shifted entirely away from seeking legal equality.
And morphed into an ideological crusade against traditional gender roles, the institution of marriage, and even biology itself.
Yes, exactly.
The book mentions a specific slogan from the 1970s. The personal is political. How does Riker interpret the danger of that phrase?
He views that phrase as the ultimate weaponization of everyday life.
How so?
If the personal is political, then every private interaction between a man and a woman,
Like who does the dishes?
who does the dishes, who asks whom on a date, how a door is opened, it is no longer just human interaction. It becomes a battleground of power dynamics and grievances.
It injected political resentment into the living room and the bedroom.
That's a great way to put it, yes.
So, if this radicalized version of feminism gained traction, where did it build its power base? Because Riker argues that it successfully captured modern institutions. How did that happen?
He argues the beachhead for this capture was academia.
The universities.
Yes. He states that starting in the 1970s and 80s, taxpayer-funded gender studies departments began popping up in universities across the Western world.
Okay.
These departments, according to the book, functioned as closed-loop echo chambers. They were staffed by ideologues who preached a new gospel.
Which was what?
That gender was entirely a social construct imposed by a tyrannical patriarchy, rather than a fixed biological reality.
So they completely rejected the testosterone-oxytocin dynamic we talked about earlier.
Completely. And what does he say is the downstream result of these academic departments?
Let me guess. The students.
Yes, he says the result was a generation of young women who were systematically taught to view history entirely through the lens of oppression, to resent men.
To reject motherhood as a trap.
Exactly. And to view traditional marriage as a form of indentured servitude.
And he points to very specific legal and societal shifts to back up this argument that society was being engineered to break down traditional bonds. For example, he heavily critiques the introduction of no-fault divorce.
Yes, this is a major pillar of his argument. He focuses on California, which was the first state to introduce no-fault divorce in 1969.
Under then Governor Ronald Reagan, which is an ironic historical footnote.
It is. Before 1969, to get a divorce, you had to prove fault, like adultery or abuse.
Right.
Riker argues that no-fault divorce fundamentally transformed marriage from a binding, lifelong cornerstone of societal stability into a temporary contract.
A contract easily dissolved by a sudden shift in feelings or a newly discovered grievance.
Exactly.
Why does he see that as so disastrous?
By removing the need to prove wrongdoing, he claims the legal system began to actively incentivize the dissolution of the traditional family.
Because it made it too easy.
Made it incredibly easy to walk away, and often financially rewarding for the party initiating the divorce.
Which statistically was more often women.
Right. He sees this as disastrous for societal cohesion, leaving men alienated from their children and financially gutted.
And then he brings this entire timeline right up to the present day with a highly critical, blistering examination of the hashtag #MeToo movement.
He does, and again, he starts with a concession here.
Right.
He acknowledges that the hashtag #MeToo movement started as a necessary and noble outcry against genuine sexual harassment and horrific assault by powerful men.
The Harvey Weinsteins of the world.
Exactly. But he claims it was almost immediately hijacked by opportunists.
How was it hijacked, in his view?
Riker argues that the movement was rapidly expanded and used to stoke mass resentment against men as an entire class.
So it became a dragnet.
Yes, it created a cultural climate of moral panic, where men were presumed guilty until proven innocent. He says the standard for evidence vanished.
Just totally gone.
Yes. The mere accusation of misconduct, even if it's just clumsy flirting or an awkward date, became enough to permanently ruin a man's reputation and career.
Completely bypassing the traditional constitutional justice systems.
Precisely.
To make this concrete, he illustrates this with a specific case study in the text about a college student named Mike. Can you walk us through what happened to Mike?
It's a really harrowing story he includes to show the collateral damage. According to the book, Mike was an average college student who was falsely accused of sexual misconduct by a female student following a consensual encounter that she later regretted.
Okay, so a regret situation.
Right. And Mike was immediately expelled from his fraternity, ostracized on campus, and dragged through a grueling Title IX administrative tribunal.
So he wasn't even allowed proper legal representation.
Exactly.
So what was the outcome for Mike?
Well, the charges were eventually dropped due to a lack of evidence, but Riker details how the experience completely destroyed Mike's life.
Because the damage was already done.
It left him deeply scarred, financially drained from legal fees, and struggling with his identity in a world that seemed to automatically view him as a potential predator simply because he was a young male.
He also cites a very high-profile case in the corporate world to show how this ideology polices thought. He brings up James Damore.
Yes, the former Google engineer. This case perfectly encapsulates Riker's argument about the rejection of biology.
Right, the memo.
Damore wrote an internal memo at Google attempting to explain the gender gap in the tech industry.
Because they were trying to figure out why there were fewer female engineers.
Right. And instead of attributing the disparity solely to systemic malicious sexism, Damore cited mainstream evolutionary psychology and scientific research
To suggest what?
to suggest that biological differences in interests might play a role. Men tending to prefer things and systems, women tending to prefer people.
Which lines up with the testosterone and oxytocin stuff we talked about.
Exactly.
And what was the reaction to his memo?
For simply citing scientific research on biological differences, Damore was immediately fired, publicly vilified, and dragged through the mud by the media.
Wow.
Riker uses this as undeniable proof that corporate culture has been captured by an ideology that prioritizes strict conformity over individual dignity, free inquiry, and objective reality.
Okay, so if feminism successfully captured academia and corporate HR departments, as Riker argues, it makes me wonder where that ideological blueprint goes next. Because Riker doesn't just stop at feminism.
No, he doesn't.
He connects it directly to what he calls its ideological counterpart in modern politics. He takes aim at the woke movement.
He does. He sees them as two branches of the exact same tree of grievance.
How does he trace that?
Riker traces the evolutionary roots of the woke movement, starting again with a legitimate cause, the civil rights era of the 1960s, which fought for equality under the law.
Right.
But then he tracks how it morphed in the 1970s with the introduction of affirmative action policies.
What is his specific critique of affirmative action?
He claims that while these policies ostensibly aim to level the playing field and correct historical injustices, they actually resulted in systemic reverse discrimination.
So the pendulum swung too far.
According to him, yes. He argues that under affirmative action, highly qualified individuals, often white or Asian men, were explicitly passed over for university admissions or jobs based solely on their race or gender to fill diversity quotas.
He views this as the moment the movement shifted from seeking equality of opportunity to demanding equality of outcome. And he says that was the canary in the coal mine. Because you fast forward to the 2010s, and he highlights the rise of what became known as social justice warriors, or SJWs, primarily on college campuses.
Right. He describes SJWs as self-appointed, radicalized guardians of public morality.
How do they operate?
According to Riker, they began policing everyday language with a terrifying, cult-like religious fervor. This is when we saw the introduction of academic terms into the mainstream.
Like what?
Concepts like microaggressions, where entirely innocent comments are interpreted as subconscious violence, and the demand for safe spaces to protect college students from hearing ideas they disagree with.
Hold on. Before we move deeper into this, the book draws a very strong parallel between this modern work movement and historical Marxism. But words like Marxism or communism get thrown around a lot in political debates. How exactly is Riker defining the connection here? What is the actual mechanism that links them?
It's a vital question. The author argues the connection is the methodology of weaponizing resentment. If we look at classic Marxism, Karl Marx weaponized class struggle. He divided society into two groups: the oppressed proletariat, the workers, and the oppressor bourgeoisie, the owners.
So he fed on the very real resentment of the poor to overthrow economic systems.
Exactly.
And Riker points out that wherever this specific Marxist methodology was implemented, it didn't lead to utopia, it led to disaster.
He gives stark historical examples. He points to the Soviet Union, which we discussed, where millions starved under collectivist farming. But he also points to more modern examples, like Venezuela under Hugo Chavez.
What happened there under this framework?
Chavez ran on a platform of pure class resentment, promising to take wealth from the elites and give it to the poor. The Marxist policies he implemented led to the complete destruction of the private sector, hyperinflation, extreme shortages of food and medicine, and the mass emigration of millions of Venezuelans.
He also mentions North Korea in this context, right?
Yes, he points to the Kim dynasty, which he says exploits a perpetual state of economic grievance, paranoia about the outside world, and engineered poverty to maintain absolute, godlike authoritarian control over its citizens.
The point Riker is making is that the Marxist framework of dividing the world into oppressors and oppressed always leads to tyranny.
Yes.
Okay, so that's classic Marxism based on class. How does that translate to the woke movement today?
Riker argues that modern movements use ideologies like postmodernism and critical race theory, or CRT, to function in the exact same way.
Can we pause and define those? What does he mean by postmodernism and critical race theory in this context?
Simply put, postmodernism is a philosophical approach that rejects the idea of objective truth.
It says truth is relative.
It argues that what we call truth, or science, is actually just a narrative created by those in power to maintain their dominance. Therefore, everything must be deconstructed.
And critical race theory.
Critical race theory takes that concept and applies it to race and law. It argues that racism isn't just about individual prejudice. It is baked into the very foundational structures, laws, and institutions of Western society.
So instead of class struggle, they use identity.
Exactly. Riker argues they swapped out class for identity politics, race, gender, sexuality. The methodology is identical.
Divide society into the oppressed and the oppressors.
And weaponize the resentment of the marginalized groups against the majority. Their goal, according to the book, is to relentlessly deconstruct and dismantle Western civilization's traditional structures.
Like the nuclear family, meritocracy, capitalism, objective truth.
Right. And to do all that without offering any viable, cohesive, or stable alternatives to replace them. It is an ideology of pure demolition.
And this brings us to a really poignant, almost tragic part of the book regarding the male experience today. Because if the culture is captured by an ideology that views traditional structures as oppressive, where does that leave the men who were raised to uphold those structures?
It leaves them in a very bad place.
Riker dives deeply into what he calls the double bind of masculinity.
It's one of the most compelling sociological observations in the text. He describes this maddening, inescapable paradox that modern men find themselves trapped in.
How does the double bind work?
On one hand, men are still expected by the deep biological undercurrents of society, and by women, to be strong, stoic, assertive, capable providers and protectors.
But the moment they actually exhibit those exact traits,
They're immediately shamed, disciplined by HR, and labeled with the buzzword toxic masculinity.
it is a brutal lose-lose situation.
It is. If a man is assertive and competitive in the workplace, he is called aggressive, toxic, or a bully.
But if he tries to pivot and shows vulnerability or weakness,
He is often mocked, passed over for promotion, or finds that his partner loses attraction to him despite society constantly claiming that it wants emotionally open, vulnerable men.
the book argues this double bind leaves young men in a perpetual state of paralysis and anxiety. They are completely unsure of how to act, what they are allowed to say, or what their actual role in the world is supposed to be.
And Riker points to the very real, devastating public health consequences of this alienation. He doesn't just rely on theory here. He cites hard data.
Like the Surgeon General's report.
Yes, he points to the 2023 declaration by the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, who announced a public health epidemic of loneliness and isolation in America, noting specifically that young men are disproportionately affected.
Why does Riker think men are hit hardest by this loneliness epidemic?
He argues that progressive cultural narratives constantly portray male leadership, ambition, and traditional masculinity as inherently oppressive or dangerous.
And young men absorb that.
When young men absorb this message from school, media, and culture, they internalize it. It leaves them feeling lost, inherently flawed, worthless, and profoundly isolated.
Riker draws a direct line from this ideological demonization of men to the skyrocketing rates of male depression, substance abuse, dropping out of the workforce, and male suicide.
He does.
And he claims the mainstream entertainment media plays a deliberate, active role in reinforcing this narrative.
Absolutely. He points out how male leaders, and specifically fathers, have been consistently portrayed in television and movies over the last 30 years.
They are rarely shown as wise, capable heads of the household anymore.
Instead, they are portrayed either as abusive villains or, more commonly, as bumbling, incompetent fools who need to be rescued by their much smarter wives or children.
He specifically names cartoon characters like Homer Simpson and Peter Griffin as prime examples of this trope.
Yes, the idiot dad trope. While it might seem like harmless comedy, Riker argues that the relentless, decades-long repetition of these caricatures of male ineptitude is a deliberate cultural attempt to mock and fundamentally undermine traditional male authority and leadership in the eyes of the public.
It teaches children that fathers are a joke. It paints a picture of a relentless, multi-front assault on men. It's heavy. But here is where the book makes a massive, necessary shift in its tone. It doesn't just wallow in the grievance and tell men the sky is falling. Riker outlines how men are fighting back.
This is a crucial pivot. He doesn't view men as permanent victims.
Right.
He observes that men are utilizing technology, satire, and the creation of alternative media ecosystems to build a formidable counterculture.
Technology is obviously central to this pushback.
Right.
How does he view the internet's role, considering how toxic social media can be?
He has a nuanced view of the internet. He acknowledges the dark side, that social media algorithms are designed to drive engagement through outrage, which can create frustrating, radicalizing echo chambers that just loop grievance back on itself.
Right.
However, he also points out a critical advantage. These same algorithms reward absolute clarity, authenticity, and conviction.
And how has that helped the resistance?
This dynamic has inadvertently bypassed the old progressive gatekeepers of traditional media. It has given conservative, traditional, and dissenting ideas a massive, decentralized megaphone to reach millions of young men directly.
Let's talk about the specific tools of rebellion he outlines, because they are fascinating. First up, he talks about meme warfare.
Yes, he unpacks the rise of internet meme culture, specifically looking back at the 2016 election and the phenomenon of Pepe the Frog.
For those who might not know, how does the book explain Pepe?
He explains that Pepe started as an entirely innocent, slightly absurd cartoon frog in an obscure webcomic.
But then it got co-opted.
But young men on internet message boards co-opted the image, remixing it into thousands of different contexts to mock mainstream politicians and progressive pieties. The media panicked and labeled a cartoon frog a hate symbol.
Which Riker argues proved exactly how fragile the mainstream narrative was.
Exactly. Riker calls memes the modern-day pamphlets of our revolution, similar to the pamphlets handed out during the American Revolution.
Because they're simple and shareable.
Memes are simple, visually striking, highly shareable, and deeply subversive tools. They use humor and absurdity to bypass intellectual defenses and push back against the suffocating, overly serious narratives of academia and the media. You can't write a 5,000-word academic paper to defeat a meme that makes millions of people laugh at you.
He also tackles a very controversial internet event, Gamergate. And he frames it in a way that is entirely contrary to the mainstream media narrative we've all been fed.
This is a bold section of the book. The mainstream consensus views the 2014 Gamergate controversy as a coordinated campaign of misogynistic harassment against women in the video game industry.
But Riker doesn't see it that way.
Not at all. Riker frames Gamergate as an early, necessary wake-up call. He views it as a highly successful use of technology by a massive group of young men, gamers, who were united by a common grievance.
And their grievance wasn't against women, he argues.
No, it was against what they saw as blatant media hypocrisy, cronyism, and the falling ethical standards and progressive preaching infiltrating gaming journalism. He sees it as the moment young men realized they had collective power if they organized online.
And speaking of pushing back against progressive preaching, he talks extensively about humor as kryptonite. He says the woke movement thrives on forced compliance and silencing dissent, but satire exposes its absolute absurdity.
Yes, authoritarian ideologies cannot survive being laughed at. He specifically cites the rise of the Babylon Bee, the conservative satirical news site.
He brings up a specific headline they ran that perfectly illustrates this.
It's a hilarious example.
Yeah.
The Babylon Bee ran a headline that said, CNN purchases industrial-sized washing machine to spin news before publication.
It's funny because it taps into a shared truth, but what is the deeper strategic point Riker makes with that joke?
Riker uses that headline to probe a larger philosophical point. Good, robust ideas do not need protection from censorship, and they certainly don't need academic safe spaces.
So the satire exposes them.
By lampooning these ideologies and institutions, satire strips them of their terrifying aura of authority. It exposes the fragility and the humorlessness of their arguments. Once you laugh at the emperor for having no clothes, he loses his power over you.
Because of the incredibly hostile environment in mainstream institutions, Hollywood, academia, corporate media, Riker champions the massive rise of alternative platforms. Where are these men going if they are locked out of the mainstream?
He lists specific platforms and figures that are leading this charge, building a parallel economy of ideas. The most obvious and powerful example he points to is Joe Rogan.
Rogan is a juggernaut. Why does Riker think he's so important to this demographic?
Because Rogan's massive podcast completely bypasses traditional media gatekeepers. He doesn't need a TV network's permission to broadcast.
And the format helps too.
He offers raw, unfiltered, 3-hour-long dialogues that appeal heavily to men who are starved for nuance and authentic curiosity. He treats his audience like intelligent adults, which is the exact opposite of how the mainstream media treats them.
Riker also highlights the structural platforms that make this financial independence possible.
Yes, he points to platforms like Substack for writers and Patreon for creators. He describes them as a modern-day patronage system.
How do they work for the resistance?
These platforms allow independent thinkers who have been demonetized, fired, or canceled by mainstream outlets to not only survive, but to thrive financially and intellectually by connecting directly with their audience.
He also mentions video and news networks like Rumble, The Daily Wire, and Blaze Media as crucial alternative ecosystems that are providing the traditional viewpoints the mainstream actively suppresses.
Yes.
The book also cites a specific, loosely affiliated group of intellectuals known as the intellectual dark web, or the IDW. Riker views them as pioneers in this space.
He does. He mentions a roster of figures like evolutionary biologists Brett and Eric Weinstein, neuroscientist Sam Harris, political commentator Dave Rubin, psychologist Jordan Peterson, conservative debater Ben Shapiro, and dissident feminist scholar Christina Hoff Sommers.
What unites that diverse group of people, according to the book?
What unites them is their shared willingness to publicly challenge woke orthodoxy and defend free speech. Riker says these figures have built massive, highly influential careers outside the mainstream system.
They prove to millions of young men that you can have honest, difficult, nuanced conversations about biology, culture, and truth without bowing to progressive ideological pressure or fear of cancellation.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered the history, the biology, the capture of institutions, and the digital resistance. Now we need to bring this down to the individual level. Riker moves from macro-societal observations to highly actionable, practical advice for the listener. This is his blueprint for reclaiming masculinity.
This is where the book functions almost as a survival manual. Riker argues that you cannot just sit around consuming internet content and feeling angry. You have to take actionable steps to reclaim your purpose, your identity, and your pride.
He starts with personal responsibility and the absolute importance of re-educating yourself.
Yes, because if the universities are compromised, you have to become your own teacher. He urges men to actively seek out and read counter-narratives, to understand the deep historical and economic flaws in progressive thinking.
Who does he suggest reading?
He specifically cites reading authors like the brilliant economist Thomas Sowell to understand how markets actually work versus how Marxists claim they work, and the fiercely independent social critic Camille Paglia to understand the biological realities of sex and art that modern feminism tries to erase.
Then he introduces a very modern concept he calls digital discipline, because as we mentioned, the internet is a double-edged sword. It can liberate you or it can trap you in a doom scroll of grievance.
Exactly. To avoid being consumed by the endless outrage cycle of social media, he recommends taking control of your digital environment.
How?
He advocates using specific software applications like Freedom and Stay Focused. These apps allow you to block distracting websites, limit your time on Twitter or Reddit, and curate your digital intake so you are consuming knowledge, not just rage bait.
And he doesn't ignore the toll this culture war takes on the mind.
He doesn't. He advocates strongly for utilizing meditation and mindfulness apps like Headspace or Calm to actively protect your mental health, manage your cortisol levels, and maintain the stoic focus required to build a life in a chaotic world.
I found his advice on career independence to be really compelling, especially for young men feeling trapped in corporate HR environments that demand they state their pronouns or take bias training.
It's a major point of his blueprint. He suggests actively leveraging remote work platforms like Upwork and Fiverr to design an independent freelance lifestyle.
Right.
He explicitly cites the author and entrepreneur Tim Ferriss, famous for the 4-hour work week, as a model for this kind of geographic and financial freedom.
Why is that independence so vital to his framework?
Because if you don't rely on a massive woke corporation for your paycheck, they cannot control your speech or your behavior. By unchaining yourself from an environment that demands ideological conformity, you gain immense personal sovereignty and power. You become uncancelable.
He also touches on how to present yourself to the world through personal branding.
Right. Riker uses the entrepreneur and philosopher Naval Ravikant as a prime example of how men can establish themselves as independent thought leaders. Naval uses platforms like Twitter and LinkedIn not to post resumes, but to consistently share valuable, high-leverage, long-term thinking.
So you build authority.
Riker says that by building a public reputation based on competence and authority, men can transcend corporate gatekeepers and attract opportunities directly.
But the author makes it very clear that you cannot live entirely on the internet. He places a massive emphasis on physical, natural male leadership in the real, tangible world.
The digital world is just a tool. The real world is where life happens. To illustrate real-world mastery, he uses former Navy SEAL and ultra-endurance athlete David Goggins as the ultimate modern exemplar.
Goggins is famous for pushing past unimaginable pain. How does Riker apply him to this philosophy?
Goggins had a terrible childhood, faced racism, poverty, and obesity. He had every right to be consumed by resentment. But he didn't wait for someone else to validate his victimhood or lead the way.
He took control.
He took absolute punishing control of his own life, his mind, and his physical body through extreme discipline and mental toughness. Riker argues that by conquering himself, Goggins became a beacon of strength and an undeniable leader for millions of men. That is the archetype men should strive for.
Beyond the individual, Riker points to the unexpected role of religion as a powerful collective bulwark against progressive ideology.
This is an interesting sociological observation, regardless of your personal faith. Riker views traditional religion as one of the last remaining institutional structures that hasn't been entirely captured by the woke movement.
He references a very specific event to prove this, the 2021 Southern Baptist Convention. What happened at that convention that was so significant?
During this massive gathering of the nation's largest Protestant denomination, a resolution was fiercely debated and ultimately passed that explicitly opposed critical race theory and modern gender ideology.
Wow.
The convention officially declared these ideologies to be entirely incompatible with biblical teachings and objective truth.
So they drew a line in the sand.
Riker views this not just as a theological dispute, but as evidence of massive faith communities actively fighting back to preserve traditional social structures and biological reality.
And finally, building on that idea of community, he emphasizes the absolute necessity of building strong, real-world networks outside of the digital sphere.
He issues a strong call for the creation of new fraternal networks, groups of men meeting in person to share skills, train, and support each other. More importantly, he calls for the rigorous defense of the traditional nuclear family unit, with men proudly taking up the mantle as providers and protectors.
Why is the family unit the ultimate goal here?
Because the traditional family, operating behind closed doors, is the vital space where core values, history, and resilience are passed down to the next generation, completely safe from state or institutional indoctrination. It is the fundamental building block of a sane society.
It is a truly comprehensive blueprint. It's designed to take the individual out of a state of passive, paralyzing resentment and move them into a state of active, highly disciplined construction.
Exactly. It's about channeling the biological energy of grievance into the creation of competence.
Which brings us to the end of our incredibly deep dive today. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought inspired directly by the architecture of the source material we've just unpacked.
It's an important question to ask yourself.
If resentment is, as the book argues, a primal evolutionary tool that has historically been weaponized against men to dismantle traditional institutions, how can you, as an individual man, harness your own valid sense of grievance? How can you use that biological fire not to destroy, not to complain on the internet, but to relentlessly build, create, and construct a life of such undeniable competence and independence that it makes those captured progressive institutions entirely irrelevant to your success.
That is the ultimate profound challenge posed by the text. Build something they cannot touch.
It certainly is the ultimate challenge. Thank you for joining us for this extensive, deep analysis. Please remember to take a second to like and subscribe to the show right now so we can keep bringing you these deep dives into the culture.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
And we have a very strong call to action for you today. You need to read the primary source for yourself to truly grasp the depth of this framework. Go to Amazon, Kindle, and Google Playbooks right now to buy Grievance to Power: How Resentment Shapes History. And be absolutely sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his ongoing writing and analysis. We will see you next time.